You know, I've lived a long life, 101 years on this earth, and I've seen things that would make most folks lose sleep for the rest of their days. But there's one memory that still wakes me up at night, still makes my hands shake when I close my eyes. It was the summer of 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country of Normandy, France, when my own platoon left me for dead. My name is James Callahan, but everyone who knew me back then called me Jack. I was 21 years old, just a kid from a small town in Ohio who thought he knew what war was from the pictures in the newspaper. Let me tell you something, friend. Nothing prepares you for the real thing. Nothing prepares you for the smell of cordite mixed with blood, the screams of dying men, or the weight of knowing that every breath might be your last. Before I continue with this story, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this and you find value in hearing the truth about what happened to men like me, men who gave everything they had on foreign soil, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be told, and your support helps make sure they reach the ears that need to hear them. Now let me take you back to France, to the summer that changed everything I ever believed about loyalty, survival, and the human spirit. I grew up in a little town called Millfield, about 40 miles south of Columbus. My father worked at the steel mill, same as his father before him, and my mother kept house like women did back then. We weren't rich, but we had enough. A little white house with a porch swing, a garden out back where my mother grew tomatoes and green beans, and a church down the street where we went every Sunday morning. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of '41, I was 19 years old and working at the hardware store on Main Street. I remember standing in the street with everyone else, listening to President Roosevelt's speech on the radio they'd set up in the window of the barbershop. His voice was calm but firm, telling us about the day that would live in infamy. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, saw the fear and the anger and the determination, and I knew right then that my life would never be the same. I enlisted the next morning, walked right into the recruitment office before they'd even finished their coffee. The sergeant behind the desk looked me up and down, asked if I was sure I knew what I was signing up for. I said yes, though I didn't have the slightest idea. None of us did. They sent me to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for basic training, 12 weeks of hell in the summer heat. I learned to shoot, to march, to take orders without question. I learned to hate the enemy I'd never met, to love the men who suffered beside me, to push my body beyond anything I'd thought possible. And somewhere in those endless days of drilling and sweating and praying, I stopped being a boy from Ohio and started becoming a soldier. After basic, they assigned me to the 29th Infantry Division, a unit made up of men from Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania. We trained for 2 years in England, waiting for the invasion everyone knew was coming. 2 years of preparation for a battle that would last less than a day, but would change the course of history. I made friends in England, real friends, the kind you only make when you're facing death together. Tommy O'Brien was a red-headed kid from Boston, barely 20 years old, with a quick wit and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. He'd been a boxer before the war, had the crooked nose and the scarred knuckles to prove it, but he had the gentlest heart of anyone I ever knew. He wrote letters to his mother every night, filling page after page with stories and jokes, never mentioning the fear that kept us all awake. Then there was Lieutenant Patterson, our platoon leader, a graduate of Virginia Military Institute who carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man born to lead. He was only 24, but he seemed decades older, his grey eyes holding a wisdom that made us trust him with our lives. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, but when he gave an order, you obeyed without question. Sergeant Miller was different, a grizzled veteran of the First World War who'd re-enlisted at 42 because he said he couldn't stand watching from the sidelines. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin, a souvenir from the trenches of France, and he walked with a slight limp from a bullet he'd taken at Belleau Wood. The younger men were afraid of him, but I saw past the rough exterior to the heart underneath. He kept a picture of his daughter in his helmet, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, I'd see him taking it out and staring at it like it was the most precious thing in the world. We landed on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day they called it, the Day of Days. I still remember everything about that morning, every sight, every sound, every smell. The grey water of the English Channel, choppy and cold, making half the men in our landing craft sick before we even saw the shore. The distant rumble of naval bombardment, so loud you could feel it in your chest. The way the sky lit up with tracer fire as we got closer, streaks of red and orange cutting through the morning mist. The ramp dropped, and the world exploded into chaos. Machine guns opened up from the bluffs above the beach, their bullets ripping through flesh and metal with equal indifference. Men fell before they even got their feet wet, toppling backward into the boat or forward into the surf. I saw Tommy go under, dragged down by the weight of his pack, and without thinking I reached down and hauled him up, holding his head above water as we struggled toward the shore. The beach was a nightmare, a hellscape of smoke and fire and screaming men. Bodies floated in the shallows, turning the water pink with blood. The sand was clogged with the debris of war, abandoned equipment and broken tanks, and the twisted remains of obstacles the Germans had planted to stop us. Bullets snapped past my ears, so close I could feel the heat of their passage, and I remember thinking with strange clarity that this was it. This was how I was going to die, on a beach thousands of miles from home. But I didn't die. I made it to the seawall somehow, crawling on my belly through sand that seemed to stretch forever. Tommy was beside me, his face pale but determined, and together we pressed ourselves against the cold stone and tried to catch our breath. Behind us, the beach was chaos. Ahead of us, the bluffs rose like a wall, bristling with German guns. We fought our way up those bluffs, inch by bloody inch. I don't remember much of it, just flashes, fragments of memory too terrible to fully grasp. The face of a German soldier as I drove my bayonet into his chest. The sound of a man screaming for his mother, his legs blown off by a mine. The smell of burning flesh and gunpowder and fear. By the time we reached the top, the sun was setting, and half the men I'd started with were dead. Those first weeks in France were a blur of firefights, sleepless nights, and the constant gnawing fear that every hedgerow might hide a German machine gun nest. The Norman countryside was beautiful, I remember that much. Rolling green fields, old stone farmhouses, apple orchards heavy with fruit. But beauty meant nothing when you were dodging mortar rounds and watching your friends get cut down by enemy fire. The hedgerows were the worst. Those ancient earthen walls, topped with dense brush and tangled roots, turned every field into a fortress. The Germans had been preparing these defenses for years, digging in machine gun positions and mortar pits, laying mines and booby traps along every path. We couldn't see them until we were right on top of them, and by then it was too late. We'd lose a dozen men taking a single field, only to face another one just like it 100 yards ahead. I watched friends die in those hedgerows, men I'd trained with, laughed with, shared my fears with. One by one they fell, and the survivors kept pushing forward, because that's what we were there to do. We didn't talk about the dead, didn't have time to mourn them. We just kept moving, kept fighting, kept praying that we wouldn't be next. It was July 19th, 1944, when everything went wrong. I remember the date because it was my mother's birthday, and I'd been thinking about her all morning, wondering if she was baking her famous apple pie back in Ohio, wondering if she was praying for me in that little Methodist church on Main Street. I had no way of knowing that by nightfall she'd have reason to pray harder than she ever had before. Our platoon had been tasked with clearing a German-held village called St. Lo. The brass said it was a key transportation hub, that taking it would break the enemy's supply lines and open the road to Paris. What they didn't tell us was that the Germans had fortified that town like it was Berlin itself. Every building was a bunker, every street was a kill zone. We moved out at dawn, the morning mist hanging low over the fields like a burial shroud. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers, a cruel contrast to the violence we knew was coming. Lieutenant Patterson led the way, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the hedgerows for any sign of the enemy. Sergeant Miller brought up the rear, making sure no one fell behind, his gruff voice a constant presence in our ears. Tommy was walking beside me, quiet for once, his usual jokes replaced by the focused concentration of a man who knew what was at stake. He'd aged in the weeks since D-Day, we all had, but there was still something boyish about him, something hopeful that refused to die no matter how much death he witnessed. The approach to St. Lo took us through a maze of hedgerows and sunken lanes. The farmers had been walking these paths for centuries, never knowing that one day they'd run red with the blood of young Americans. We moved in single file, rifles at the ready, ears straining for any sound of the enemy. The only sounds were our footsteps, our breathing, and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere to the east. The Germans hit us about a mile from the town. It started with a single shot, a crack that echoed through the morning stillness, and Private Jenkins, the point man, dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Then all hell broke loose. Machine guns opened up from multiple positions, mortar rounds started falling like rain, and suddenly the peaceful French countryside had transformed into a slaughterhouse. I hit the dirt and started crawling toward a stone wall about 50 yards ahead. Bullets were snapping through the air above me, close enough that I could feel their heat on the back of my neck. Chunks of earth exploded around me as mortar rounds found their marks, each impact sending showers of dirt and debris raining down on my helmet. Tommy was right beside me, his face white with fear, but his jaw set with determination. We moved together inch by inch, knowing that to stand up would mean instant death. Behind us, I could hear the screams of the wounded, the crack of rifles, the shouted orders of men trying to organize a defense in the midst of chaos. We made it to the wall and started returning fire. I couldn't see what I was shooting at, just muzzle flashes in the hedgerows ahead, but I kept pulling that trigger, kept feeding rounds into my M1, kept praying that somehow we'd make it through this alive. Lieutenant Patterson was somewhere to my left, directing fire, trying to coordinate a counterattack. Sergeant Miller was moving along the line, dragging wounded men to cover, his voice calm and steady despite the madness around us. For a moment, I thought we might actually hold, might actually survive this ambush and push through to our objective. That's when the mortar round hit. I don't remember the explosion itself. One moment I was firing at the enemy, and the next I was flying through the air like a rag doll. I felt a searing pain in my chest, my leg, my everywhere, and then I hit the ground hard and everything went black. When I came to, the world was silent. Not the silence of peace, but the ringing, muffled silence of a man whose ears have been shattered by high explosives. The sky above me was impossibly blue, not a cloud in sight, and for a moment I wondered if I'd died and gone to heaven. I tried to move, but pain shot through my entire body like lightning. My left leg felt wrong somehow, twisted at an angle that legs aren't meant to twist. My chest was wet, and when I looked down, I saw that my uniform was soaked with blood, though whether it was mine or someone else's I couldn't tell. I tried to call out, but my voice came out as nothing more than a croak. The sun was higher now, burning down from a cloudless sky, and I could feel its heat on my face. Flies were already buzzing around me, drawn by the scent of blood, landing on my wounds with a persistence that would have made me sick if I'd had the strength to care. I was dying, I knew that much, lying in a field in France, far from home, far from everyone I loved. I thought about my mother, probably asleep in her bed in Ohio, not knowing that her son was bleeding out on foreign soil. I thought about my father, who'd told me he was proud of me the day I shipped out, who'd shaken my hand with tears in his eyes. I thought about all the things I'd never get to do, the life I'd never get to live. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear the sounds of the battle continuing in the distance. Gunfire, explosions, the rumble of tanks. My platoon was still fighting, still pushing towards St. Lo, but they'd left me behind. They'd seen me take that mortar hit, seen me lying motionless in the grass, and they'd made the only decision they could. In the middle of a firefight, you don't stop to check pulses. You keep moving or you die. I don't know how long I lay there, hours, certainly. The sun moved across the sky, and the sounds of battle faded into the distance. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind wandering to strange places. I saw my mother standing at the kitchen window, waiting for me to come home. I saw my father sitting in his chair by the radio, listening for news from the front. I saw Tommy laughing at one of his own jokes, that big Irish grin splitting his freckled face. I saw my grandmother, too, who died when I was 12, standing in a field of sunflowers with her arms open wide. She was calling my name, telling me to come to her, and for a moment I wanted nothing more than to answer that call. But something held me back, some stubborn spark of life that refused to be extinguished. The blood loss was making me delirious. I saw things that couldn't have been real, heard voices that had no source. At one point I was convinced that the war was over, that the Germans had surrendered, that Tommy was walking toward me with a bottle of champagne and a smile on his face. But then the pain would come crashing back, and I'd be lying in that field again, alone and dying. But I wasn't dead yet. Some stubborn part of me refused to give up, refused to let go. I don't know if it was courage or stupidity, but something inside me kept fighting, kept holding on to that thin thread of life. Maybe it was the thought of my mother, waiting for me to come home. Maybe it was the memory of my father's handshake, the pride in his eyes. Maybe it was just the brute animal instinct that makes all living things cling to existence, even in the face of the inevitable. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. Footsteps. Careful, measured footsteps, coming closer through the tall grass. I tried to reach for my rifle, but my arms wouldn't obey me. I was helpless, completely at the mercy of whoever was approaching. I expected a German come to finish me off or take me prisoner. I'd heard stories about what the SS did to wounded Americans, and in my weakened state, I couldn't even form a prayer for a quick death. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. The footsteps stopped, and a face appeared above me. For a moment I thought it was a German come to finish me off. But then I saw the eyes, deep brown and filled with concern, and the face of an old Frenchwoman looking down at me. Her hair was grey, pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was lined with the weight of years and sorrow. But her eyes, those eyes were alive with compassion. She spoke in French, words I couldn't understand. But her hands were gentle as she examined my wounds, her touch as soft as my mother's had been when I was sick as a child. She called out to someone behind her, and soon there were more faces, more hands, lifting me carefully from the ground. They carried me through the fields as darkness fell, using back paths and hidden lanes that the Germans didn't know about. Every jolt of movement sent waves of agony through my body, but I bit down on my tongue and stayed silent. These people were risking everything to save me, a stranger from a country they'd never seen. The least I could do was not give us away. The farmhouse they brought me to was ancient, its stone walls weathered by centuries of Norman rain, a thatched roof that had been patched and repatched over generations. Windows that were little more than slits in the thick walls, designed to keep out the winter cold and the prying eyes of enemies. Inside, oil lamps cast flickering shadows and the smell of wood smoke and herbs filled the air. They laid me on a rough wooden table, and the old woman began working on my wounds. Her name was Marie Dubois, and she was 73 years old. I learned later that she'd lost her husband in the First War, lost her only son at Dunkirk in 1940. She had every reason to hate soldiers, every reason to leave me dying in that field, but instead, she saved my life. She had no proper medical supplies, no morphine, no antibiotics. What she had was knowledge passed down through generations of peasant farmers, knowledge of herbs and poultices and the healing power of the human touch. She cleaned my wounds with boiled water and packed them with moss and wild honey. She set my broken leg with splints made from apple tree branches, binding them tight with strips of linen. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I screamed until my voice gave out, then lay there shaking as she continued her work. But through it all, she never stopped, never hesitated. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly what needed to be done. When it was over, she covered me with a blanket and sat beside me, holding my hand as I drifted into unconsciousness. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was her face, lined with age, but soft with compassion, the face of an angel in that hell of war. I spent the next 3 weeks in that farmhouse, hidden from the German patrols that still controlled the countryside. Marie and her daughter-in-law, a young widow named Colette, cared for me around the clock. They changed my bandages, spooned broth into my mouth and kept watch through the long nights. Colette was 28, with dark hair and sad eyes that spoke of a grief too deep for words. Her husband, Marie's son, had been a school teacher before the war, a gentleman who loved books and music and had never held a gun in his life. But when the call came, he went, because that's what men did. He died on the beaches of Dunkirk, cut down by German aircraft while trying to reach the boats, and Colette had been wearing black ever since. Despite her sorrow, or perhaps because of it, she was incredibly kind to me. She sat with me through the worst of my fever, cooling my forehead with damp cloths and speaking softly in French. Words I couldn't understand, but found comfort in, nonetheless. She taught me my first French words, simple things like water and bread and thank you, and laughed gently at my terrible pronunciation. The danger was constant. German soldiers passed by the farm almost daily, looking for food, for horses, for any excuse to terrorize the local population. They'd already taken most of Marie's livestock, left her with just a few chickens and a milk cow, too old to be of much use. But still they came, searching for resistance fighters, for hidden weapons, for any sign of disloyalty to the Reich. Twice they came to the door, and I was hidden in a secret cellar beneath the kitchen floor, lying in the darkness, while heavy boots walked inches above my head. The cellar was cramped and damp, smelling of earth and potatoes and old wine. I could hear the German voices harsh and demanding, and Marie's calm replies. I held my breath, convinced that at any moment they would find me, that I would be dragged out into the light and shot as a spy. But Marie was brilliant. She played the role of the harmless old woman perfectly, offering the soldiers eggs and cider, chattering about the weather and her chickens, all while I lay beneath her feet, bleeding through my bandages and praying for deliverance. But the danger wasn't just from the Germans. There were collaborators in the village, French men and women who'd thrown in their lot with the occupiers. Any one of them could have reported us, could have turned us all over to the Gestapo. Marie knew this, knew the risk she was taking, but she never wavered, never showed a moment of doubt. I asked her once, through Colette's translation, why she was helping me, why she was risking her life for a stranger, an American she'd never met before and would probably never see again. She looked at me for a long moment, her brown eyes filled with something I couldn't name, and then she spoke. She told me about her husband, Pierre, who had died in the trenches of Verdun in 1916. He'd been a farmer like his father before him, a man who loved the land and the rhythms of the seasons. But when his country called, he went, because that's what men did. He never came home. She told me about her son, Jean, who had grown up without a father, who had learned to work the farm at an age when other boys were still playing games. She told me how proud she was when he became a teacher, how he'd met Colette at a dance in the village, how happy they'd been in the brief years before the war came again. And she told me about the day the telegram arrived, the day she learned that her son had died, just as her husband had, in a war that seemed to have no end. She'd wanted to die herself then, she admitted, had thought about walking into the ocean and letting the waves take her away from the pain, but something held her back, something kept her going. And then she found me, lying in that field, bleeding and broken and alone. And she knew, she said, that this was why she'd been kept alive, not to mourn the dead, but to save the living, not to give in to despair, but to fight it with every act of kindness she could muster. I wept when she told me this, wept like a child, lying in that rough bed in that ancient farmhouse, holding the hand of a woman who had lost everything and still found the strength to save a stranger. I'd thought I understood sacrifice before, thought I knew what it meant to give yourself for others, but I didn't, not until that moment. As my strength slowly returned, I began to piece together what had happened to my platoon. Colette spoke a little English, learned from her husband before he'd gone off to die at Dunkirk, and she told me what she knew. The Americans had taken Saint-Lô finally, after days of brutal fighting. The Germans had been pushed back, but they were regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. The front lines were fluid, shifting daily, and the farmhouse was caught in a no-man's land between the two armies. At night, we could hear the artillery, distant thunder that made the windows rattle in their frames. Sometimes the fighting came closer, and we'd have to put out all the lights and sit in darkness, listening to the sounds of combat just a few fields away. Those nights were the longest, the fear almost unbearable, but Marie would sit beside me and hold my hand, her presence a comfort that no words could express. I thought about my friends often during those long days of recovery. Tommy, with his jokes and his courage, Lieutenant Patterson, who'd led us through hell and somehow kept us fighting. Sergeant Miller, tough as nails and twice as sharp. Were they still alive? Had they made it through the battle? I had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty gnawed at me like a physical wound. But there was another thought that troubled me even more, a thought I tried to push away but couldn't escape. They'd left me. They'd seen me lying in that field, and they'd kept moving. I knew it was the right decision, knew that stopping would have gotten more men killed, but still, the feeling of abandonment was hard to shake. Marie seemed to understand what I was going through, even without words. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sunset, she came and sat beside me. Through Colette's translation, she told me a story about her son, about how he'd been left behind during the retreat from Dunkirk. His body had never been found, and for years she'd wondered if he might still be alive somewhere, waiting to come home. But then the letter came from one of his comrades, a man who'd made it back to England on one of the little boats. He told her that her son had stayed behind to cover the retreat, that he'd volunteered to man a machine gun while others escaped. He'd known he wasn't coming home, but he'd done it anyway because that's what soldiers do. She looked at me with those deep brown eyes, and she said something I'll never forget. She said that sometimes being left behind isn't abandonment. Sometimes it's sacrifice. Sometimes the ones who stay are the ones who matter most. I didn't understand it then, not fully, but over the years I've come to see what she meant. Those men who left me in that field, they didn't do it because they didn't care. They did it because they had a job to finish, because the mission was bigger than any one man. And in a strange way, their decision to keep fighting was an honor, not an insult. They believed in the cause enough to keep going, even when it meant leaving a friend behind. As July turned to August, the war moved on. The Americans broke out of Normandy, racing across France toward Paris. The German lines collapsed, and suddenly the nightmare that had gripped the country for 4 years began to lift. We heard rumors of the liberation. Stories passed from village to village, each one more hopeful than the last. The village was liberated on a bright August morning, and I stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, leaning on a crutch made from an old broomstick, and watched as American tanks rolled down the main street. The villagers poured out of their homes, waving flags they'd hidden for 4 years, kissing the soldiers, crying and laughing, and embracing one another. I tried to call out, to wave, to make them see me, but my voice was too weak, my body too broken. I just stood there, tears streaming down my face, watching freedom arrive on treads and steel. The soldiers who found me couldn't believe I was alive. A medic checked my wounds and shook his head in wonder, saying he'd never seen anyone survive injuries like mine without proper medical care. But he didn't know about Marie, about her herbs and her poultices, and her stubborn refusal to let me die. They loaded me onto a truck and drove me to a field hospital near Cherbourg. Along the way, I passed through the ruins of Saint-Lô, the town my platoon had fought so hard to take. It was almost completely destroyed, nothing but rubble and ashes and the ghosts of the dead. I thought about the men who died there, Americans and Germans and French civilians, all of them someone's son, someone's father, someone's friend. War doesn't discriminate in its cruelty. At the hospital, I finally got the news I'd been dreading. Tommy O'Brien was dead. He'd been killed on July 20th, the day after I went down, hit by a sniper while clearing a building in Saint-Lô. Lieutenant Patterson was gone too, caught in an artillery barrage on the 22nd. Sergeant Miller had made it, but he'd lost an arm and been shipped back to the States. I lay in that hospital bed and wept. Not just for Tommy and the lieutenant, but for all of them, all the young men who'd crossed that ocean with dreams of glory and found only blood and mud and death. We'd been so naive, so certain that right would triumph and good would prevail. And maybe it did in the end, but the cost, my God, the cost. I spent 3 months in various hospitals, watching my wounds slowly heal and my strength gradually return. The doctors wanted to send me home, to discharge me as unfit for combat. But something in me rebelled against that idea. I thought about Marie, about the risk she'd taken to save me. I thought about Tommy, who died fighting for something bigger than himself. How could I go home when there was still work to be done? So I convinced them to let me stay. Not as a frontline soldier, my leg would never be the same, but as a translator and liaison officer. I'd picked up some French during my weeks with Marie, enough to make myself understood, and the army was desperate for anyone who could communicate with the local population. I spent the rest of the war in France, moving from village to village as the Allies pushed toward Germany. I saw Paris liberated, stood in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, and watched French men and women dancing in the streets. I saw the horror of the concentration camps, the walking skeletons, and the piles of bodies that haunted my nightmares for years afterward. I saw the final collapse of the Nazi regime, the end of a madness that had consumed an entire continent. But through it all, I never forgot Marie Dubois and that little farmhouse in Normandy. When the war ended, I went back to find her. The farmhouse was still standing, a miracle in itself after all the fighting that had swept through the region. And there she was, sitting in her chair by the fire, looking older and more tired than I remembered. She didn't recognize me at first. I'd changed, filled out, grown a beard to cover the scars on my face. But when I spoke her name, when I thanked her in my halting French for saving my life, her eyes lit up with a joy that made all the suffering worthwhile. I stayed with her for a week, helping to repair the damage the war had done to her farm. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. Some bonds go deeper than words, deeper than language or nationality or anything else that divides us. She'd saved my life, and in doing so she'd given me a purpose, a reason to keep fighting, a debt I could never repay. When I finally left, heading back to the States and a life I could barely remember, she pressed something into my hand. It was a small wooden cross, carved by her husband decades ago, worn smooth by years of handling. She told me it had protected her son through most of the First War, that she wanted me to have it now. I still have that cross. It sits on my bedside table, right where I can see it every morning when I wake up. It reminds me of her, of that farmhouse, of the summer when my platoon left me for dead, and an old French woman refused to let me die. I went home to Ohio after the war, married a wonderful woman named Sarah, and raised 3 children. I worked at the factory for 40 years, went to church on Sundays, and tried to live the kind of life that would make Tommy proud. But I never forgot what I'd learned in those hedgerows, never forgot the lessons that France had taught me about courage and sacrifice and the power of human kindness. The men who left me in that field, I don't hold it against them, not anymore. They did what they had to do, what the war demanded of them, and in their own way, they honored me by continuing the fight. That's what soldiers do. That's what we all did. But the real heroes, the ones who deserve to be remembered, are people like Marie Dubois, the ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to do the right thing, even when it would have been so much easier to look away. They didn't have uniforms or medals or parades in their honor. They just had their humanity, and they held on to it when the whole world seemed to be going mad. I'm 101 years old now. Most of the men I fought with are gone, their names carved on monuments and their stories fading into history. But I'm still here, still telling this story, still trying to make people understand what it was like. War is hell, no question about it. I've seen things that I wish I could forget, done things that still keep me up at night. But I've also seen the best of humanity, the courage and compassion that emerge when everything else is stripped away. I've seen men give their lives for strangers, seen ordinary people become extraordinary in the face of evil. That's what I want people to remember, not the blood and the death and the endless suffering, but the moments of grace that made it all bearable, the hand that reached out in the darkness, the voice that whispered encouragement when all hope seemed lost, the simple act of kindness that saved a young soldier's life in a field in France. I've thought a lot about why I survived when so many others didn't. There's no rhyme or reason to it, no grand plan that I can discern. The mortar round that hit me could have killed me instantly, like it killed the men standing beside me. Marie might have walked a different path that day, might never have found me lying in that grass. 1,000 little things had to go right for me to be sitting here today, telling this story. But I like to think that I survived for a reason, not because I was special or chosen, but because there were stories that needed to be told, memories that needed to be preserved. Every time I share what happened to me, what happened to all of us, I'm keeping their legacy alive. Tommy O'Brien, Lieutenant Patterson, Marie Dubois, all the named and nameless souls who shaped my journey through that terrible summer. After I came home from the war, I struggled for a long time. They didn't have a name for it back then, but I know now that I was suffering from what they call post-traumatic stress. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the sudden moments of panic when a car backfired or thunder rolled across the sky. I'd wake up screaming, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, and Sarah would hold me until the shaking stopped. For years, I didn't talk about what I'd seen. It was too painful, too raw, too difficult to put into words. Most of the other veterans I knew felt the same way. We'd nod at each other on the street, recognizing the haunted look in each other's eyes. But we never spoke about it. The war was over, and we just wanted to move on, to build new lives from the ashes of the old. But the memories didn't go away. They'd ambush me at odd moments, triggered by the strangest things. The smell of wood smoke would take me back to Marie's farmhouse. The sight of apple trees in bloom would remind me of those Norman orchards, so beautiful and so deadly. The sound of fireworks on the 4th of July would send me diving for cover, my heart pounding with the echoes of artillery. It wasn't until my own children were grown that I started to open up. My son, James Jr., he served in Vietnam, came back with his own set of scars, and when I saw him struggling, saw the same darkness in his eyes that I'd carried for so long, I knew I had to do something. We started talking, really talking, for the first time in our lives. I told him about France, about being left for dead, about Marie and the farmhouse and the long journey home. And he told me about the jungles of Southeast Asia, about the friends he'd lost and the horrors he'd witnessed. We didn't solve anything, didn't heal each other's wounds with words. But there was comfort in knowing we weren't alone, that someone else understood. That's when I realized the importance of sharing these stories. Not for glory or recognition, but for healing. Every veteran who hears about my experience knows that they're not the only ones who struggle, not the only ones who carry invisible wounds. And every civilian who listens gains a little understanding of what we went through, what we gave up, what we brought home with us. I went back to France again in 1984 for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Sarah came with me that time, and together we walked the beaches where so many had fallen. Omaha Beach was peaceful now, a stretch of golden sand with children playing in the surf. It was hard to believe that the same place had once run red with blood. We visited the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, row upon row of white crosses stretching toward the horizon. I found Tommy's grave, said a few words to him, told him about my life, my family, all the years he never got to see. And I thanked him for his courage and his friendship and his sacrifice. 40 years later, and I still missed him like it was yesterday. We went to Marie's farmhouse too, but she was gone. She'd passed in 1967, Colette told us, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 96. But her spirit was still there, in the stone walls and the ancient fireplace, in the apple trees she'd planted and the garden she'd tended for so many years. I stood in the doorway where she'd first found me, where I'd watched the American tanks roll through, and I said goodbye. Colette gave me something that day, a photograph of Marie from before the First War, when she was young and beautiful and full of hope. I keep it next to the wooden cross on my bedside table, a reminder of the woman who gave me back my life. The years have a way of putting things in perspective. When you're young, everything feels so urgent, so important. Every decision seems like life or death. Every setback feels like the end of the world. But from where I sit now, looking back over a century of living, I can see that what matters isn't the grand gestures or the dramatic moments. What matters is the small kindnesses, the quiet acts of courage, the love we share with the people around us. I've been lucky in so many ways. I survived the war when so many didn't. I came home to a loving wife and built a family that I'm proud of. I've had the chance to tell my story, to honor the memory of those who never got to tell theirs. And I've lived long enough to see the world change in ways I never could have imagined. But I've also known sorrow. Sarah passed 10 years ago, and not a day goes by that I don't miss her. James Jr. is gone too, taken by the cancer that finally claimed so many Vietnam veterans. And with each passing year, more of my generation slips away, taking their stories with them into the silence. That's why I keep talking, keep sharing, keep remembering, because someone has to. Because the lessons of that war, the sacrifices of that generation, they matter. They matter because they remind us what we're capable of, both the terrible and the magnificent. They matter because they show us what happens when good people stand up to evil, when ordinary folks find extraordinary courage. I think about that French farmhouse sometimes when I'm lying in bed and sleep won't come. I think about the way the morning light came through the windows, the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, the sound of birds singing in the apple trees. It was a simple place, nothing fancy, but for 3 weeks it was my whole world. My sanctuary, my salvation, my second chance at life. And I think about Marie, that remarkable woman who saw a wounded enemy soldier in her field and chose to see a human being instead. She didn't have to save me. God knows the Germans had given her every reason to hate anyone in uniform. But she looked past the uniform, past the nationality, past all the things that divide us, and she saw something worth saving. That's the lesson I want to leave behind. That's the story I want people to remember, not the battles or the bloodshed, but the humanity that persists even in the darkest times. The knowledge that no matter how bad things get, no matter how much evil seems to triumph, there are always people like Marie Dubois. People who refuse to give in to hatred, who insist on doing the right thing, who save lives one small act of kindness at a time. I was left for dead in a field in France in the summer of 1944. My platoon moved on without me, and by all rights I should have died there, alone and forgotten. But I didn't die. I lived because of the courage of an old French woman and the grace of whatever power watches over us in our darkest moments. And now, 101 years old and counting, I'm still here, still bearing witness, still telling the story. Because as long as I have breath in my body, as long as I can still form the words, I will never let them be forgotten. Not Tommy, not Lieutenant Patterson, not Marie, not any of them. They deserve to be remembered. They earned that much and so much more. So that's my story, the story of how I was left for dead and found my way back to life. It's not pretty and it's not heroic, at least not in the way the movies would have you believe. But it's true. Every word of it, as true as I can make it after all these years. Thank you for listening, for taking the time to hear an old man ramble about things that happened long before most of you were born. If my story touched you in some way, if it made you think or feel or remember, then I've done what I set out to do. And if you know a veteran, any veteran from any war, take a moment to thank them. You might not understand what they went through, but your gratitude means more than you know. War leaves scars that never fully heal, wounds that time can only soften but never erase. I carry mine with me every day, in the way I walk, in the nightmares that still come, in the faces of the dead that I see when I close my eyes. But I also carry the memories of kindness, of courage, of the moments that reminded me why we were fighting in the first place. That's what I hold on to now, in these final years of my life. Not the horror, but the hope, not the darkness, but the light that broke through even in the worst of times. The knowledge that when my platoon left me for dead, I wasn't really alone, that there are angels in this world, even if they don't have wings. That love is stronger than hate, and that even in the depths of war, humanity finds a way to survive. I'm tired now. The telling of this story has taken more out of me than I expected, but it's a good kind of tired. The tiredness that comes from doing something that matters. I've kept my promise to Tommy, to Lieutenant Patterson, to Marie. I've told the truth as best I can remember it, and I've trusted you to carry it forward. In France, in 1944, my platoon left me for dead. But I didn't die. I lived, and every day since then has been a gift, a miracle, a testament to the power of human kindness in the face of unspeakable evil. That's my story, that's who I am, and that's what I want the world to remember. God bless you all, and God bless the memory of those who gave everything so that we could be free.